3 pieces of setup and then 3 arguments. The first one is that we obviously support attending medical school. As a highly intelligent person, we probably have some choice in which medical school to attend and the ability to assess our tastes preferences. We'll choose the one which aligns with those best. As part of that though, we would point out that this does not require a total abandonment of any other interests. We're willing to accept you have to spend less time maybe at your local Labour Party branch or whatever. We can still be involved and we'll just explain why you can do more of that stuff in the long run if you go to medical school. Second piece of setup, this is not a policy debate. We think the likely counterfactual is you do pursue politics given the information in the info slide, but I would note the vast majority of our benefits are general, that is doctors as opposed to any other field of work or employment. Those stand no matter what the counterfactual is. And thirdly, we'd point out that the actor's precise balance of interests is actually somewhat unclear, even with the information provided in the info slide. So we would note there's a particular premium on flexibility, and we'll prove why being a doctor is far better than the likely alternative on that basis as well. 3 arguments then in the speech. Firstly, being a doctor, which requires going to medical school, is the most direct way to do good for the world, which is clearly something you care about per the info slide. 2 parts to this argument. Firstly, why are you unlikely to be able to achieve this with a career in politics? There are 4 reasons why. The first is that there's a lot of uncertainty associated with this career. That is, you need to win an election, you rely on skills which you don't know you have, stuff like charisma, stuff like personability, which is not mentioned at all in the description of the actor. And we would point out that success in politics often relies on early success. That is, very rarely does someone who loses an election, or God forbid, multiple elections, get pre-selected going forward. Often being a loser once taints you forever, which explains why that randomness is particularly destructive. Secondly, even if you succeed, you need to toe the party line in the vast majority of jurisdictions in the vast majority of the world, which means you're subject to things like lobbying. You're subject to things like pre-selection pressure to follow the views of particular leaders, which means you're subject to a composite set of views from everyone within your party and can't just support the things you care about, which explains why a lot of the time as a politician, you're not actually achieving issues you care about. You're not working towards your convictions. You're just doing general stuff which many other people could do. Thirdly, often to be an effective politician, you need to horse trade, you need to make concessions, and it's difficult to determine in the moment whether per your general moral views, each decision you're making is that good or that bad. Fourthly, it's often the relative difference between you and the next best politician is very low, whereas in the vast majority of the world, there is a major shortage of doctors, which is to say, if you become a doctor, you are most likely to be making a difference, whereas choosing to become a politician is unlikely to make as much of a difference, given plenty of people want power. Finally, we would just point out there's a strong chance you actually regret your time as a politician. Many people's views change over time. Many political systems which are made for one end are corrupted and serve a different end. It's hard to say whether you are even proud at the end of the day of the things you do as a politician. As a doctor though, many of the benefits you would want to accrue as someone who cares about the world accrue much more directly, and we would say not just comparatively against politicians, but also comparative against any other counterfactual that this team could prove. That is, firstly, you're much more likely to succeed in medical school as someone who has a proven track record of strong academic performance, as well as a high intellect, which is associated with performing well in school, particularly something like medical school, which isn't just about skills which might not correlate with high intellect, like creativity, but mostly about things like hard analysis or learning facts. You're very likely to succeed in medical school, which is a prerequisite for doing anything else. But beyond that, we'd also just say very simply, you're more likely to be able to do things like save lives. You're more likely to do things that improve people's happiness. And would point out, to the degree that there's a strong chance you live in the developing world where the vast majority of people live, there really is a shortage of doctors. There really is a shortage of medical care. Meaning, even if you are not the best doctor, despite being highly intelligent, even if there are troubles associated with your career, you're much more confident that you are doing good, that you are helping people, that you are providing a service which is valuable, and very few counterfactuals offer the same degree of certainty. So on a direct, which career is more helpful, being a doctor is a uniquely helpful one on that front. But secondly, we would also point out that medical school helps you do good things in a variety of ways, which aren't just associated with pursuing a career as a doctor. That is, first, a range of simple altruistic things which compound on top of each other, and which the actor would be free to choose a combination of some, all, or none at all. Things like volunteering, either in a major way with Doctors Without Borders, or even in a very small way, like reducing the price you put on your services as a doctor working in a local community. It's stuff like being able to be a registered, doer of whatever, of first aid, meaning no matter what context you're in, your skills are still valuable, your skills are still helpful. It's like being able to do incredibly important research, either on a big scale, trying to improve cancer treatment or improve things like the treatment of malaria, or researching things which are deeply important to you as an actor. Maybe someone in your family suffers from particular medical problems. Maybe someone you care about suffers from particular medical problems. Those are all unknowns, but having a medical degree helps, no matter what the situation on that front is. And finally, we point out that even just the wage you earn as a doctor can be donated away. The wage you earn as any actor can be donated away, and that is a benefit if you care about things like effective altruism or helping other people. The framing here is you can do lots of different stuff with a medical degree. Some requires you actually become a doctor, like the Doctors Without Borders stuff and the benefits in our first argument, but some allow you to pursue other careers entirely based on volunteering if you want, careers entirely based in something else, but where your medical degree is still helpful, because you can be volunteering, you can be the first line of first aid, you can help people in a variety of different ways. And we would note a career as a doctor, even if you care about stuff like politics, may even still be helpful. Often the vast majority of people who get elected successfully have some other career prior to that. And we've proven why you can pursue this career in a way which is very community oriented, helping your local community, offering lower prices, so on and so forth. So even if politics is your number one care, we explained that a medical degree and the variety of ways you can use that medical degree are likely to help you get elected. The sum of that argument is a medical degree is fairly flexible and you can use it in a variety of ways to advance your interests. The final argument in this speech is just about personal benefit, which will explain why no matter how you choose to use your medical degree, it will be good for you as an individual. Firstly, if you choose to become a doctor or anything related to medical stuff, you enjoy a lot of prestige. There tends to be respect associated with doctors. If you are a politician, by comparison, you're seen as slimy, half the people vote for the other party and hate you, right? And the impact here is very straightforward. Although people don't like to admit it, it matters what other people think about you. It matters to your happiness, it matters to your conviction, like your ability to keep up the fight you think is important. Much easier if people are affirming you rather than having half of the political spectrum hating you. That prestige point stands in particular against the politics stuff. But secondly, we would also point out being a doctor is a uniquely mobile career for the reason that doctors are needed almost everywhere, whereas, for instance, a politician is tied to their seat and the capital city of the country they're in or their state or whatever. This is substantially more flexible. Again, we don't know the actor's precise interests and preferences. A medical degree allows you to cater to a variety of uncertain situations. Thirdly, you make way more money as a doctor than the vast majority of other careers. Your wage is very high. Things like if you're in Australia, the HEC system, if you're anywhere else, any other form of student loan, tends not to be particularly burdensome if your income as soon as you leave university is high, because you don't have much time for that debt to compound. You can pay it off before the principal gets indexed up over and over and over again. And since doctors make a fair amount of money out of uni, since we've shown they are in demand and fairly scarce, you're less likely to struggle from that than any other form of education. You often also get paid during training because you're offering a service while you're pursuing your degree. And finally, we would also just point out there's a range of specializations. So even if the actor doesn't care as much about money as other things, you can balance those interests against each other by specializing in something that either makes lots of money, if you care about that, or less money, but which has more of a social outcome. For instance, working in the emergency room versus something like plastic surgery. That flexibility is valuable. But finally, we would just point out medical school and the path we provide is much better for developing relationships. You spend more time in a pedagogical environment where you meet a diversity of different people as opposed to specializing more quickly by not going to medical school, moving into work and knuckling down sooner. That's a range of benefits. Ultimately, with so many unknowns, flexibility and conquering things like money and prestige are most important. We offer those things. Proud to you guys.
I'd like to thank Professor Affirmative for that speech. Welcome to the first update again.
I think it's really funny that Dan focuses so much on flexibility because it seems incredibly unintuitive that going to medical school, which you have to do, like a 3-year postgrad medicine program, then a couple of years of placement at a hospital before specializing until you finally reach kind of the peak career where you actually do earn money and stuff like that, just does not give you flexibility to discover what you like and what you don't. Comparatively, a career in politics is, as they point out, something that is quite nebulous. You can do a bunch of different things, figure out your interests, figure out what you enjoy. So I think that it is for that reason, because you were young, because you are clearly indecisive, that locking yourself into going to medical school is just not a good decision. 2 things in this speech. Firstly, on why medical school is bad and you should not go. Secondly, on why politics is good and you should do that. Let's talk firstly about medical school being bad. Just at the beginning of this, I would just like to point out that medical school is something that obviously people do individually find incredibly stressful and difficult. It has an incredibly high workload, and I'll give some more reasons in a bit. But I think that to the extent that this team talks pretty much entirely about kind of your long-term ability to help people, if you have to suffer through like years of just being unhappy, this individual probably also does care about that, and that should be weighed as an interest. A fun fact Oscar told me in prep is that apparently 40% of medical students have suicidal ideation. Clearly, it is something that is incredibly difficult to go through for a few reasons. Why is that? Firstly, the culture is really, really negative. That's because there tends to be a sink or swim attitude where if students do need support, they're viewed as inadequate and viewed as they will fail when they go on to become a doctor because they don't have, you know, the strength or the bravo to be able to kind of handle with that. Secondly, that's because you just are exposed to highly traumatic content. That's because you do hear and see about situations where people's lives are ruined by things, you know, like cancer, by terminal illnesses, where they are, you know, struggling, their bodies are degrading, and the impact that has on families and communities beyond that. You even just see stuff like cadavers and stuff like that from the very first days, and you were given very little support for that because that is just seen as normal by the academics who are training that and are exposed and desensitized to that. So that itself can be something that is very difficult, and I would suggest if you are particularly, you know, a compassionate person and someone who wants to do well, something you are likely to find particularly difficult. Thirdly, people often enter and just get disillusioned because the long term just is not nearly as good as this team points out. That's because firstly, there just is a lot of time in training where you just are, you know, a medical assistant in a hospital and have to do all the grotty, you know, not nice jobs. That is because the pay is not great in a lot of the world, unlike what this team says. For example, I'd point to the UK doctor strikes, where some doctors are paid less than hospitality workers for work where you do need an incredibly qualified, postgraduate degree. That looks like awful conditions where you are doing massive night shifts, where because there are shortages, you're being asked to stay longer. And people, once they're at medical school, talk to people who have this experience. They talk to people who are working, they're being taught by these people. They themselves know that that is their future, become disillusioned with that, but have to stick with it because they have sunk, because they made a decision, because they've sunk a lot of time into this, but also because, again, that is the culture they are surrounded by, and they are told that that sacrifice is one you ought make if you care about people, despite it being individually very, very difficult. The next thing to say is that once you become a doctor, or even, you know, while you're at medical school, doing harm is quite likely. And that's to say that even while you may benefit some people, you are also likely to destroy other lives quite materially, and that's something that's likely to be very difficult for you to the extent you care about that. What does that look like? That looks like just medical systems that are really dysfunctional across the world, systems that have inbuilt ableism, where, you know, it takes 7 years to get access to treatment for certain illnesses because, you know, for example, endometriosis, which a lot of people just are locked out of being able to get medication or treatment for because there are systems that do not cater to those needs. That looks like people being labelled with personality disorders when they go to the ED room, and that's coming up years later when they go, you know, when they have legal issues, and that being used against them in those situations. That looks like entire fields of surgery that do not do anything really to prolong life, but instead are popped up because they are financially lucrative and because they develop fields of science that are speculative and long term, despite, again, not meaningfully impacting people's lives, instead forcing them to incur debt and suffering. That is to say, there is obviously a lot of dysfunctionality within medical systems across the world, and being part of that and having to witness that, and you yourself having to deal with people who have been hurt by that, who have been hurt by the colleagues you are surrounded by and the people you studied with, but who you yourself may actively hurt in some instances as well. Because you kind of do have to go along with that to some level, because these are things that are inbuilt, because you can't, you know, like if there are prescription laws that mean you cannot give someone the medication they need, you can't individually, you know, break that or reform that, and so you kind of are handcuffed into continuing to do that harm. But additionally, even if the medical system is perfect, you yourself are likely to make mistakes, to misdiagnose people, to, I don't know, cut the wrong thing during surgery, and therefore directly cause someone to, you know, continue suffering, or I guess not to be healed, or all of those kind of things. Things do go wrong in these processes, and I would suggest it is the one death or the one person who is harmed, even if you are able to save a bunch of other lives, that really does affect you to the extent you wanted to make people better, and that you see and like mull over the suffering of that, something that obviously doesn't happen when you go into politics. So doing harm is very likely. It is, I think, a necessity of going into medicine, which is why doctors obviously have such high insurance plans, because it is recognised that, you know, things do go wrong very, very regularly. The next thing to say here is that medical school itself often selects against people who are, like, I guess, have emotional intelligence, or, you know, who are compassionate. And this is just for the reason that they're like, oh, you have really top grades. Everyone who goes to medical school has really top grades. Like, to get into, you know, like Monash medicine, you need to have gotten like a 99.95 A for undergrad and, like, you know, other stuff. Like, it's super competitive, which means that interviews are often used as a thing to distinguish between people. And they often do distinguish on things like whether you have an intellectual passion for medicine, whether they perceive you as likely to burn out. And you, if you are compassionate and want to do this to help people, and are indecisive and into other things like like politics are likely not to meet these criteria very clearly, which I think flips what they say about how you can probably pick any medical school you like. Actually, I would suggest you probably can't. You probably are more tied than other people, but it also suggests you are likely to burn out because they make those assessments because they see these sort of people burn out. I think that means that you are also additionally surrounded by people who do not meet your level of compassion. The final thing to say here is just about why you have no flexibility when you go into medical school. That's because you incur a whole lot of debt. They're like, HECS and financial systems. A lot of countries do not have systems like that. You do have to pay your debt back quite imminently, and you do not earn massive amounts of money on the outset of being a doctor. Even if you are a junior doctor, you earn some money, but not, heaps and heaps of heaps. And also because you've sunk such a lot of time into medical school, you're likely to have to stick, with that. You do not want to retrain to the extent that retraining for medical school was really traumatic. You really don't want to go back to uni when you're in your 30s and admit that all over, which means you have very few options. Maybe you can go do medical research or something else, but let's compare that to the multitude of options you have if you pursue politics. Why are they just pursuing politics is good? Just because you have many pathways you can move between it. What are the possibilities here? This looks like going and getting some professional experience. Most people who are in politics have, some form of careers before that, so you can do whatever you're interested, whatever you enjoy, whatever, opportunities you have. You can become a staffer. You can move between candidates to the extent that you want different experience in different workroom cultures and stuff like that. You can work in other roles before you run pre-selection. You can do things like economics, journalism, whatever you enjoy. What I think you're bound to do to the extent you want to go into politics is probably something relatively in that vein, but also continue to volunteer with the party that you already volunteer for. Something that to the extent you have done it throughout uni, you probably know people there, you probably enjoy it and find it fulfilling. To the extent you're again considering doing it into the future, you probably have enjoyed it to quite a high degree. As I kind of said, you probably have networks there, you think it's fun, so you probably just continue doing the thing you already continue doing, compared to medical school, where you do not have nearly as much time, which means you probably cannot do that to the same degree as if that is something you can kind of do as an option. Overall, that means you have diverse options. You can move between them if you're unhappy. You can kind of figure out what you want to do. You're not tied into studying all day, every day. Again, I think just briefly on spare time, where because you are not studying at a really competitive school with lots of really academically, students that isn't really strenuous, you are just able to do things like pursue relationships, whether they're friendship or romantic relationships. Notably, you are in a time when you are leaving anything uni, you're in your 20s. This is a time when a lot of people want to enter romantic relationships, potentially look at doing things like settling down and having kids. And when you go to medical school, a lot of people just do delay that until their 30s. I think it's good to have the opportunity to do that, to have more leisure time and hobbies, as well as being able to just work in that time and earn money rather than actively accruing debt is probably good and alleviate some level of stress. At the end of that, if you do that, if you take on a career planning to go into politics and you decide, you probably are better informed then to decide whether a career in politics is one that would help you do good in the world or one you would find frustrating, as this team suggests. But I would just think you probably can do quite good. If not, you can do something else which is enjoyable or negative.
Thank you first negative or second response.
Sorry, Sophie, you might.
Oh, sorry. First, you have more fun. Second, you do more good. Third, we have our cake and eat it too. Firstly, you have more fun. I want to note that this is where the negative team spends most of their first negative speech, but it is the less important half of this debate. Firstly, it is not your priority, given that, as we know from the info slide, you are entering your career with the express desire to do good in the world. And secondly, that you have many other avenues for things like leisure and fulfillment outside of your job. The thing you should consider when choosing what career path you enter is the altruistic effect on the world. We give you a range of reasons which are not individually responded to why it is more personally fulfilling to go to medical school. You get benefits of money, mobility, you don't get privacy violations you would as a politician, the doctors are beloved and prestigious, whereas politicians are despised by their opposition and distrusted by everyone. You get intellectual fulfillment you wouldn't otherwise. In response to this, they give a few claims. The first is that medical school is expensive and long. Firstly, obviously, yes, you are constrained in flexibility at the start, you are entering a long process, but our claim is you get much more freedom and time later on in your life where you can use that well, where you're, for instance, in the time where you want to have children or want to start a family in your 30s rather than using that when you're younger. But secondly, it's less expensive than they say because student loans exist in every country, even if systems like HECS don't. And thirdly, because those loans are paid off by your higher salary that you get later on. And I note that you begin to be paid during your training, and all of this compounds if you are such an intelligent and high mark achieving person. But fourthly, note that if your political career fails, you probably need to retrain or to enter a different industry. And these guys do so little work to defend politics in that first negative speaker speech. I'll rebuild that in a moment, but you should be very, very unsure that your political career will be successful, and therefore you should consider that those harms apply to them. But finally, yes, medical school might be a cost, but it is worth it to you because you would enjoy it and get value out of it. What do they say to contest that claim more importantly? They say medical school is very stressful, and I would note firstly that many of the reasons they give, like there's a toughen up attitude, people aren't sympathetic, are totally symmetric and also just unproven. Like clearly being successful in politics requires you to be tough. People are famously not sympathetic to whiners in politics. It's a very competitive industry as well. But I would note, insofar as both of these things are high pressure environments, medical school is the one that you should choose for 4 reasons. Firstly, because the stresses of medical school are much more knowable. You can, for instance, plan for exams. You have a career structure laid out ahead of you compared to the randomness of election cycles, of PR scandals, of personality games, that it is far difficult for anyone to understand and predict, and particularly for you, given we know you're highly intelligent, but not necessarily Machiavellian or particularly good at charisma. Secondly though, more resources exist for you to cope in medical school. Things like a cohort of dedicated people who you can help and bond with. And obviously you have colleagues in politics, but your group at medical school is usually smaller and more close-knit. Like that's just a fact about how small medical cohorts are. And also it remains the same year on year, so you develop tighter relationships. But secondly, there are tons of mental health resources available to these people. And I just want to contest the largely unproven characterization from First Negative, which is these are just hives of stress and suffering. Medical students usually do have resources at their disposal, and there are structural reasons you should believe that that is true, because they are young and sympathetic, unlike politicians. They are attached to educational institutions that are highly sensitive and increasingly sensitive to their legal liabilities, and they wish to attract the best students in the first place, which indicates that even though, of course, medical school is a very high-pressure environment, there are resources like counselors, like mental health support that exist for people to cope. But finally, that stress is fun. You are learning, you're getting a sense of achievement that you particularly value. And of course, for some people, negotiations and power play could also be fun, but far less reliably and certainly so, given that, as we know from the info slide, your personality is defined by intelligence rather than things like Machiavellianism or a desire to play those power games. The next and better claim they give is, well, maybe after medical school, when you become a doctor, your life's gonna suck because medicine is traumatic and harmful. Firstly, why are you doing harm? Like maybe the medical industry is sexist and racist. It's unclear that you have to be sexist and racist as a doctor. And in fact, if you are a particularly progressive and altruistic person, you can probably do even more good because you're pushing against an already bad system. But secondly, you can just choose non-evil specialities or specialities which have less risk of harm. For instance, you could become a dermatologist or a GP, where it's very unclear that you're in those kinds of highly stressful life or death situations. But secondly, yes, you might have some trauma, some difficult emotional engagements. Of course, that is true as part of being a doctor. That does not mean the career is not worth entering, because in addition to maybe making some mistakes, you are also saving lives. That is the trade-off they don't countenance, and you are saving far, far more lives than you get rid of. And you personally value doing good, so you are likely to put your own psychological well-being below the value of the lives that you are saving. But thirdly, as I noted before, you're likely to develop tools to cope, things like having a strong cohort of your colleagues, like counselors, like programs, and you have the money to fund those things because, as we explained, unresponded to, you simply do just have a higher salary. Fourthly, many people who are doctors deal with it, right? Like they learn to comfort themselves psychologically, they develop those coping mechanisms. Obviously, they're not true all of the time, but we think most people can cope. But finally, this case in this issue, but also just broadly throughout that speech, is so uncomparative. Like they do so little analysis to defend why politics is not also scary and traumatic, particularly when you are making horse trades or trading off people's interests. Maybe you have to horse trade the welfare budget for the healthcare budget, and you end up inadvertently killing 1,000 people because you decrease the funding for nurses and hospitals, which also would weigh very deeply on your conscience as a deeply harmful thing to do. The final benefit they push here is, well, maybe you get more flexibility and time. I would note, one, that you need to be extremely successful in politics in order to be able to move between areas with the degree of flexibility that they say. That is very unlikely and it's entirely unproven by them. But secondly, their benefit is just like, well, you can do whatever you want. What if what you want to do is medicine? That is not analysis. They need to prove the converse, which is that medicine is not good. But finally, the more you believe their flexibility stuff, the more you should believe that you can be very easily fired and that your life is very uncertain because you can be easily moved around departments. And finally, the benefit of having more time is not necessarily true, given that to prove yourself in this industry, where there's often a less set career path, where you have fewer formal regulations on what's happening to you, you need to work much harder than the next guy. And you probably have worse relationships. Maybe you have more time, but you don't have intelligent people around you with whom you form close emotional bonds and can form those relationships even if you could have more time to do them in. So that doesn't fall to them. Clearly, you have more fun. But next, the more important part of this debate, you do more good. As we explained clearly at Daniel, there are just so many stumbling blocks for a successful altruistic career in politics. It's hard to get elected, it's hard to do good when you're elected, and any failures, which are very likely given your youth, given the absence of any evidence in the info slide about your charisma or your politicking ability, those failures are likely, and those failures condemn you forever when they happen early in your political career, compared to the fact that medicine is extremely high impact. It's a direct good that is both important and feels immediately rewarding, and it's a flexible kind of good. No response to that other than the material about potentially participating in a racist or sexist system, which I have already rebutted. We've already won the debate. Finally then, on exclusivity, we can have our cake and eat it too. Firstly, as we know, it's much easier to, for instance, volunteer or door knock or engage in politics in some informal way on our side, which I note is the most useful, most rewarding, and least corrupting kind of engagement in politics, because you don't have to do evil backroom deals. You're genuinely engaging with your community, which feels good, compared to you can't be an unlicensed doctor on the side. You can't even do very simple things like, say, administer vaccines without a degree in nursing. These things require university structures. But in addition, it's likely you're more successful in politics later in life if you want to enter it, when you already have experience because you're an older person, when you have public goodwill behind you because they think you're more trustworthy than your competitor politicians, because you are in fact a doctor and have that in your pocket. On every metric, the Affirmative team takes this debate.
Two issues in this debate. Firstly, on politics and then on medical school. So the reason I want to start with politics, because it's a counterfactual that side negative has to defend, and it's one that they fail to ever actually spell out in sufficient detail for you to concretely appreciate what it is that you'd be doing. In the absence of that clarity, it's very hard to see how this negative team can win. What do they tell you? They say, on our side, you have nothing but possibilities and time. You should ask yourself, why do you have possibilities and time on their side? And the answer is because all of the options they propose are just entry-level positions that don't require much commitment of your time, but in turn don't offer you much impact to do good, don't offer you much fulfillment, don't pay very much money, and don't really allow you to do very much with your life at all. Because being a staffer for different politicians or working as a researcher at a think tank or an NGO is not a job that lasts for the rest of your life and has three crucial problems for this team. Firstly, as I indicate, there is very limited career progression. People who work as staffers primarily do so when they're a student studying a degree and then go on to complete that degree and join a career at a different ladder using that degree or using that professional qualification. You don't go from a staffer to becoming a politician. That's not a normal career transition. So they must explain how they go from these entry-level positions to doing any of the impactful or meaningful things from which they would need to claim benefits to outweigh the huge ones we provide from med school. Secondly, they say, well, secondly, many of the options they provide for you are also not actually as easy to get into as they suggest. For example, if you want to be a journalist, that generally requires you commit to doing a journalist degree and then work very hard to get a good gig at a newspaper or a website. It's not just something you can like move between being a staffer and then be a journalist and then try out being a think tank worker. And similarly, if you want to actually have a proper gig at a think tank, normally you need a master's degree in a specialized field, which is why they would hire you and give you things like tenure. These are gigs that they cannot claim are just options on their side. They would need to pick one and commit specifically to it, locking themselves out of other options. But thirdly, the scale of impact is near nil in the vast majority of jobs that they talk about. Because in the best case, they can do very little good, and you can't even express common preferences people are likely to have. Because you don't earn very much money in these jobs, your quality of life is poor, you don't get fulfillment or meaning, there's very little prestige. So even if you just assume the actor cares about the things that most actors do, they don't ever express why you're able to do particularly well on any of those. So at the end of this issue on politics, you should believe, one, this team needs to, at third negative, actually explain what they imagine the counterfactual is, pick one option and explain how it is you would succeed through that, because the idea of, well, there are so many options you can pick between them is untrue, or requires that they concede huge amounts of benefits regarding flexibility, huge amounts of benefits regarding all of the things like money, prestige, and fulfillment. But secondly, if they want to tell you that obviously the long-term plan is politics, so they haven't explained how you get in or succeed at, note that cops all of the harm Sophie and Dan explained to you at first and second, about being hated, about how you're very likely to be corrupted by the necessity of the trade-offs involved in that job, about how there are unforeseen consequences of your actions that you're very likely to regret, about the lack of mobility, and about the fact that it's very likely you just never win that first election and your career never takes off. So many unanswered questions before this team's counterfactual can be credited, before they can even enter the debate. So let's move on to the issue of med school, because this is where we give you a wealth of options as to why this would be a great idea, and they deliver a series of nitpicks. What do they tell you? Firstly, they say med school is stressful and hard. We point out that is true, but would also necessarily be true of any counterfactual that had a similar level of prestige, money, impact, or any of the benefits that presumably we're attempting to achieve in this debate, had they decided to prove one. Secondly, we point out that you're likely to have more knowledge of the kinds of stress and harm that occur on our side and can plan around them, as opposed to sort of the vicissitudes of life that occur in political scandals or any of the other things that are likely to crop up. We talk about the better support systems, the resources, the tight social networks, and the clear meaning that is visible when you're in med school, where you can at least see at the end of the day, you'll be saving lives and doing very active good, as compared to politics, where you engage in scheming and conniving and hope at the end of the day that there is something that you can show at the end of it. Secondly, they say it's very likely that you'll end up harming someone, which is true, but you make mistakes in every career. People are harmed in every career. No explanation as to why this is in any way comparative, and note that this is a harm that scales with impact. The only reason you would do less harm when you make a mistake in politics is if you had less capacity to impact the world in politics, to concede a huge benefit that this team needs to claim. But secondly, we point out that there's a difference between an individual harm and a systemic harm. So just because the medical profession does bad things doesn't mean that you in and of yourself are responsible for doing bad things, would necessarily feel bad, particularly if you're fighting against those bad things and attempting to reform that system within. But thirdly, weighed against the preponderance of good that you're incredibly likely to do on our side as a doctor writ large, the average doctor obviously saves far more lives and improves the world far more than they do any of those harms. And compare that to the average politician, who I would suspect on net perhaps does not do good for the world, perhaps has made the world a worse place. They tell you need empathy, so it's unclear you would succeed as a doctor. Firstly, surely the fact that the key indication of what this actor is about in the info slide is really wants to do good is indicative of at least some level of compassion and empathy that would probably allow them to succeed in that profession. Secondly, the topic seems to presume that medical school is at least a very realistic alternative for this actor, so it would be reasonable to assume they can get in. But thirdly, we just suggest that, it's very likely that you have a capacity to talk about various forms of empathy. It's unclear that being into politics is some disqualifying factor for being a doctor. I suspect many doctors have engaged in politics or have had considerations about politics and have been able to get through med school. They then say, well, there's an issue of debt, and doctors often earn low salaries in places like the UK, and therefore this might be very bad for you. Firstly, even in countries like the UK, your salary is high comparative to every other profession there. Like doctors in the UK don't earn much compared to US doctors, but they earn far more than the average white-collar professional in the UK. Secondly, even if your pay is low, in countries where pay for doctors is low are countries where medical school costs tend to be low as well, because they're more subsidized to attract people in, and you're likely to have the least debt. But thirdly, this is comparative for all of the careers they suggest. Doctors earn far more than basically any of the people that they talk about on their side, like at, worst staffers, but at best working for a think tank probably pays less than being a specialist on our side. Lastly, they say there's a risk of failure, as if this does not exist for any other career. Like, obviously people fail in a variety of different careers. Obviously people feel stress in a variety of careers. Obviously a lot of people feel like the weight of other people's lives hang on them, and it's definitely true for politics. It's definitely true if you want to be a lawyer, for example, where only 1 in 7 law students will get a job in law because it's so competitive. The idea that any of these harms were unique was ludicrous, and they never explained why it was that you should consider any of them. What should you think then? We have a range of possibilities that are open to you on our side. You could, for example, just be a doctor and do direct good. You could, for example, choose to volunteer and move to another country and help cure a disease. Or do things like just volunteer in a low-income community. Or you could engage in research where you could try and cure a disease. And obviously, you're not going to solve cancer on our side. You could contribute to research. You could know that you made a meaningful addition to perhaps solving one variant of a particular disease, or better studying a part of the genome, or any of those things that were deeply meaningful. You could engage in Earn to Give, where you just gave your very high salary to a charity like GiveWell and knew that you could save thousands of lives over the course of your lifetime in addition to the work you did as a doctor. Or you could just enter politics at a later age, noting the vast majority of politicians had professional careers before they enter politics, claiming all of the highest impact benefits that this team could have. The end of this, weighing in this debate, why do we take it? 3 metrics. Firstly, on flexibility, which you should care about, because the info slide is vague as to the specific preferences of the actor, so you ought to allow them to pick, because people's preferences change over time, and because flexibility gives you capacity to adapt to changing life circumstances. If you value flexibility, clearly we give you more options. We explain many ways you could use your medical degree, whether it was practicing, whether it was doing research, whether it was just, going into politics afterwards, compared to on their side, where they don't explain options. If you cared about doing good, impacts via EA or direct work or politics were higher. If you cared about money and prestige, obviously we won the debate. This team is so far behind, there's no way they can catch up.
Like, thanks for somebody that space, welcome to negative.
Firstly, on the next 10 years of your life, whether you should spend them doing something like a career that's adjacent to politics and considering how you want to plan your political career, whether you should spend them in med school. Then on what happens after you make that decision to either become a politician or to become a doctor, noting that those likely take place around the age of 30 on both sides of the house. Firstly, on the first section of your life. We give you a series of reasons to explain that for the next 10 years, you should not choose to be in medical school. You should instead choose to enter the workforce. You should instead choose the many careers that we do actually list quite clearly in Gypsy's speech. Something like being a journalist, or a lawyer, or a civil servant, or an accountant, or some other type of job you would likely be able to access with the undergraduate degree that you would already have and you would need to have before you enter into something like medical school. The first thing to say here is that not only do we list these careers for you, but also that we explain to you that you have an immediate boost to your income because you enter the workforce immediately and you do so in a professional and full-time capacity, which clearly pays more than being a trainee doctor, which is the best case on their side. It happens maybe 3 or 4 years into medical school. The second thing that we explain conclusively in Oscar's speech in particular is that the period of time in which you are not in medical school, but are instead starting to pursue that politically adjacent career, is one in which you have far more scope to do many other things that not only make you personally happier, but also mean that you have greater capacity to do good in the ways that both sides concede are likely to be the most concrete and the most meaningful. Things like volunteering, things like being the nominated first aid rep in your workplace, things like engaging with your family and your friends and helping them out in interpersonal ways as well. The things that most people in most of their lives see as being their greatest contribution to society are things like being a good parent, raising a child who will do the right thing. are things like being a good partner to their spouse who they love. And that is something that this team actually never does deal with, but we do explain clearly in Gypsy's speech is far more able to be something you can do when you enter the workforce quickly, when you're better able to do things like buy a home, when you're better able to do things like settle down. This team would have you instead sitting in the library for 10 years, largely cut off from human contact, largely cut off from the ability to grow as a person, to better understand your preferences through doing things like experiencing the diverse range of experiences we say we can have on our time when we have that better spare time. Which means that at the end of that first 10 years, where you could have either been in the workforce or you could have been in medical school, you are a happier person, you have better finances, which means that you have more scope to make choices in many respects. You probably have a far better conception of who you are and what you care about because of the more diverse and the more real life experiences that you were able to experience. The second thing to say, though, is that when you actually make the choice between being either a politician or being a doctor, noting that both require a level like 10 years or so of doing something else with the goal of becoming that profession, right? Like you would take 10 years to do many different careers on our side or a few different careers to get the professional experience you need to become a politician, to develop your connections within the party. Some of that might be as a staffer, other periods of that time might be doing other things. Why is it that being a politician is better at that point? The first thing to say is that on our side, you do actually have a very compelling fallback option if you don't want to become a politician at that point. You already have professional experience, you already have savings that you've likely accrued over this 10 years, and you have things like references, you have things like your undergrad degree that you can rely on. Second thing, you're more likely to have a family, you're more likely to have a spouse, you're more likely to have community connections as well, which means you're better able to change your mind and just back out entirely if you don't want to make that choice. The second thing to say is that you're more equipped to, because you better understand yourself, you considered this over the past 10 years, you're likely to have those alternative finances and stuff like that. The problem on their side, though, is at the end of 10 years of medical school, where you have far less of a conception as to who you are and what your priorities are, where you have far less support, where you have far less financial options, you also have massive amounts of additional debt that you would take on uniquely on their side to become a doctor. Second thing that you have is no real ability to opt out of a medical career, because a medical degree does not translate into something that is non-medical, which means no matter what your choice is, you're locked into the emotional labor, the direct contacts with people that we explain in many instances will cause harm. That is direct and emotional. And this is your first time entering the workforce as well. That means you have far less ability to opt out. So if at the end of either period you decide that this was the wrong choice and you change, you're better able to recover on our side. But the second thing to say here is that the types of things that they describe as to why you might succeed are actually not a benefit at all. When they say things like you're compassionate, you're empathetic, you want to do well, none of that says that you would be a good doctor, because we explain clearly down our case that actually being compassionate and empathetic is a bad thing for most doctors, because it means that they're more likely to burn out when they do engage in the types of harms that we tell you are incredibly likely to occur at least a few times in that career, or indeed maybe even when you're training in medical school. At the end of this, I think what you should believe is firstly that the actual scope to do good within your career is quite limited and probably relatively symmetric on both sides. So you should prioritize the unique things that we tell you about your personal happiness and your ability to do good in unambiguous and clear ways through things like volunteering or through things like helping people in your community, which is why I think that we win quite conclusively on your capacity to engage in those things. That is quite unique on our side. And we give you, I think, about 5 kind of clear reasons why you have this. You have more money, you have a longer period before your commitment, you have less exposure to things like death and trauma and injury in medical school that possibly leave you with a mental illness, that possibly leave you very unable to engage and interact and form relationships. And you have the ability to do things like engage in good through falling in love, engage in good through being a good partner or good parent. The last thing to talk about then is just to explain why it is, I think, that in politics you are able to do relatively better concrete changes for people, though, as compared to medicine. If you don't think that we are winning on the idea that you can just be a better person, you can just do more volunteer work, you just have more connections to your community on our side. First thing to say here is that the lines that we get in Dan's speech are wrong. First thing he says, but in politics you must win in order to do change, which neglects the idea that lobbying through political parties, that voting on policy, that influencing who you volunteer through, that working as a staffer or a volunteer or somebody who helps people access the ballot box are all ways that are concrete, certain, and things you could do good in the political sphere specifically. He says that you often need to conform to the party line, but you often do not. There are often divergent factions. There are different groups that you can align with. There are many parties you can choose from. It's unclear if this debate is taking place in a country with many parties or a country with 2. If it's many parties, you have many options prima facie. If it's only 2, you likely have many factions within those parties. So you still have choice, you're still likely to see that as being fulfilling. And in fact, you have a team of like-minded people around you, which is also quite fulfilling. He says you might change values. And I think that what happens on our side, though, is that you are better able to know yourself, which means that when you do change your values on our side, you can also change your career as you go along. But if you change your values on their side, you're locked into the relatively narrow sphere of being some sort of medical professional. That is quite hard for you if you fall out of love with the medical system as a whole. When you realize things like the fact that scarcity is often caused by policy choices made by politicians around things like licensing and not around an insufficient number of things like people who want to be doctors, something you can only solve through politics, you cannot solve as a doctor on their side. Which means that I think when it comes to both helping the medical system or society generally, politics is clearly up. But even then, let's talk about medicine and the harms. The first thing to say here is that to the extent you save lives, you also likely end them. Because you are a human being, because you are likely exhausted, because you've been traumatized through medical school. And the problem here is a simple piece of weighing and a simple observation about the way that most people think. And that is that when you succeed at your career because of your training, you rarely see that as special. You often believe that all of your colleagues would have done similar things because they had similar training, similar expertise. And you tend to often not see people's flaws in the same way that you see your own. The problem is that when you make a failure, when you make a mistake, that feels unique to you, to your individual idiosyncrasies, to your individual choices, to the things that make you different to your colleagues. Which means that those failures stick with you and haunt you in a way that your successes never do. Because you look at your successes and think that anyone could have done that, that the other guy who could have had your spot in medical school could have done that. But you think your failures are unique to the things that make you you. That is unbelievably difficult to deal with. Something that means that you're far more likely to see your contribution as a doctor in any capacity, whether it's something as simple as traumatizing somebody by giving them the wrong diagnosis, the wrong medication that makes their life worse, or as dramatic as making a mistake in surgery and ending somebody's life or leaving them permanently disabled. It's being something that is unique to you and something that is particularly destructive and particularly awful. Which means that at the end of this, you don't do good as a doctor, both practically and in the way that you perceive it subjectively, and you are a less capable, less happy person who has less of a conception of their self, less of an ability to do any sort of good whatsoever. We take it clearly.
This team sounds like a wide-eyed undergrad, not someone who is highly intelligent and recently graduated. This drifting to where your heart takes you, this non-committal case, this drifting between jobs and fields is not real. Jobs value experience, opportunities require qualifications, not just having brains. That's why the precarious and hazy characterization and their unwillingness to actually commit to defending something has lost the negative team this debate. Two issues. First, on what you want, and second, on whether you get it. Let's start with what you want. I want to note that there's lots of uncertainty in life and lots of uncertainty about the actor. That's why the relevant thing teams should be doing is highlighting the push and pull factors which are attached to the info slide, not getting lost in the details of very specific hypotheticals that might produce harm. Why did we win? What do you want? Two ways. The first thing we do is point out that this side does not get to support everything that's not medicine. And we explain this in a variety of ways. We point out that many of the things they say are mutually exclusive with each other because they require training, they require experience, they require time down, and you can't flit it between them to your heart's content. And that means that they can't pick the benefits of the chill public service job and the fulfillment of a frontline like political campaigner and the connections as a staffer all at once. And in fact, they must carry the harms of each. Less money, less prestige, more hatred, more dead ends, or time in law school, time getting your master's, time retraining in journalism. And this huge uncertainty associated with each change they say you should support, each form of flexibility they say is so beneficial. For a team that is supposed to represent a highly intelligent recent graduate, they spend so much time indulging the views of undergrads who think life will turn out peachy. The fact is they needed to commit to something and they never did. But the second way we win this is explain that medicine is more flexible than any one of the things this team must defend. Because doctors, compared to everything else at least, tend to be more in demand in a wide variety of places. That your degree is still useful for helping the world through the various forms of volunteering we describe, even if you end up in the public service, even if you end up as a journalist, and that you can have unique opportunities to do research. And sure, each of these options has downsides, and this team can wax lyrical about how there are certain hypotheticals which are bad for us. But importantly, we're the side which benefits from flexibility, because we only need to support the prerequisite to any one of those situations, which is going to medical school. They need to show that any one of their alternatives is equally flexible flexible as medical school. Whether it's doing charity work, whether it's getting your master's in IR, whether it's going to law school. And that is the burden they fail to accept, and it's the burden they fail to meet. But secondly, we win this debate independently on the question of success by showing our path is more likely to yield material benefits. We show you that medical school aligns with what we know about the actor, which is very little. They're smart and they're academic. We say their alternatives do not simply and equally engage with the skills that we require. For instance, things like charisma and connections, important in politics, important in sales, important in consulting. They give you no analysis to explain why they would succeed. But thirdly, we explain that the bar we need to cross is substantially lower than the bar they need to cross. That the vast majority of doctors do good in some capacity. And even if you make mistakes, the average reasonable person does not believe that society hates doctors because they make errors. The average reasonable person does not believe that family members hate their children because they're doctors and have made errors. It's just ridiculous. By comparison, politicians are structurally hated by half the population. Losers don't get a second chance because why would politicians pre-select you again? You require qualifications to do journalism and pay heavy costs associated with each of them. Fourthly, we explain the potential upside is much higher if you do medicine compared to any one of the alternatives they need to support. Because say if you go into politics, you give up things like privacy, you give up things like a higher wage. And finally, we explain that the cost of attending medical school is absolutely a wash. For every stress factor and risk, universities have reasons to avoid liability or offer a better service to compete with their competitors. For each jurisdiction which has a crap way of teaching medicine, there are plenty of other ways which have incentives to encourage doctors to train and to serve the community. This team spends way too much time with their head in the clouds while we win this debate on the ground.